Before printing out all of your pages, you want to make sure that you are printing at the right scale. So only print out the first page with the test square and measure it to make sure it is at the right scale. Once all of your pages are printed out, you can cut them and only cut the bottom and the right sides. You can use the overview of the pattern layout to know where each page goes. Keep cutting all of your pages and start assembling them and taping them together, making sure to match the black squares in the corners and matching the lines of the pattern. So once all of your pattern pieces are cut out according to your size, you can start cutting your fabric. When cutting the bias tape, make sure you are cutting at a 45-degree angle, so you can just follow that grain line that is on the pattern piece. We want to do that because we want that piece of fabric to be elastic. And if we cut on the grain line, then it won't have much elasticity, but if we cut at a 45-degree angle, as you see here, it will have much more elasticity, and that is what we want to finish the armholes. We're gonna start by sewing the loops for the tie, so fold your pattern piece right sides together and sew at 6 millimeters, which should correspond to the width of your pressure foot. Then trim the seam allowance down to a few millimeters and turn your piece inside out. I prefer to use a loop turner, which is a really practical tool if you sew strap or ties often, but it does take some practice. You want to start by putting it through the channel and hook some fabric and start pulling gently. Keep pulling until the fabric comes at the other end and unhook the loop turner. Keep pulling the fabric with your fingers until it's completely inside out. Mark your piece at 9 centimeters and cut 2 to create loops. Moving on to the long tie, start by sewing together both short edges to create one long piece and press the seam open. Then to create the tie, I like to use a bias maker tool. With the wrong side facing up, feed the fabric into the wide end of the bias tape maker using an awl to push it through the other end. Then pull on the tape maker and iron as you go to press the folds down, always keeping the iron close to the bias tape maker. Then you'll want to fold it again onto itself and press. If you do not have this little tool, you can simply fold the tie in half lengthwise, wrong sides together, pressing to mark the fold, and fold each long side again toward the center crease, pressing again, and fold one more time to enclose all raw edges. Fold over the short edges of the tie by 1 centimeter to get nice finished ends. Then sew along the folded edge to close the tie. Take your time here and align the edges well as you're sewing. Let's move on to sewing the top of the dress. Pin the front and back pieces right side together and sew. For cleaner seams, press them open, then again to the back. Finish your seam by overlocking or overcasting. We are then going to sew the invisible bias tape to the armholes, so place your bias on the armhole right sides together and sew. When you get to the side seam, make sure that it is folded towards the back. Then from the right side, press the bias towards the seam allowance. The next step is to top stitch the bias, so from the right side, sew on the bias along the seam. Always make sure your seam allowance is laying flat towards the bias, not towards the top. Then trim the bias tape so it is a little bit wider than your seam allowance. We are then going to fold over the bias tape twice to the wrong side and closing the raw edge. Pin if you want to, I just like to fold it as I sew. So from the wrong side, sew the bias tape to the front bodice along the folded edge. The next step is to create the casing for the tie. You are going to fold over the top of the front to the wrong side by 5-6 millimeters, then once more by 1 to 1.2 centimeters. You can mark those measurements on your fabric to make it easier, but I do it freehanded. Make sure it is wide enough though for your safety pin and your tie to fit. This is why I like to sew my tie first, as its width can vary a little bit based on the fabric I'm using. Pin along your casing and use sewing clips for the ends if they're too thick for pins. Make sure to backstitch a couple times at the beginning and end. If you're having trouble starting your stitch because your fabric is thick, it is because your pressure foot is not laying flat, so using a piece of fabric or whatever you can grab to slide under it behind will help your sewing machine get started. Sew along the edge of your casing, still making sure it will be wide enough for your tie and safety pin to fit. Then we are going to move on to the casing for the back elastic. Start by trimming any bias tape that is too long. Grab your loops and fold them in half. Fold your fabric over to the wrong side by 5-6 millimeters, then again by 1 centimeter, or the width of the elastic you're using. Here it is a 6 millimeter wide elastic. Place your loops under the casing at each end and pin all along your casing. It is curved, so it might be a little tricky to fold over in some spots, but you can stretch your fabric gently and it should be fine. Sew along the edge, making sure the loops are well placed when sewing over them. Don't forget to backstitch at the beginning and at the end. From the right side of your dress, fold your loops over your casing and sew them down along the edge of the casing. Moving on to the tiers, sew your first tier at the side seams right sides together. I like to directly serge them and press to the back. To create the gathers, you need to change your stitch length to the longest you have. Mine is 5, and lower your tension to 3 or 2. With the wrong side of the front tier facing you, backstitch at the beginning and stop at the next seam. Sew along the top using a 7 millimeter seam allowance. Do not backstitch at the end, instead leave a long tail on the top thread and trim the bobbin thread close to the fabric. Repeat the same process for the back tier. Make sure your bobbin is full before gathering so you don't run out of thread mid-stitch like I did. Then create a second line of basting stitches the width of your pressure foot. Repeat this process for the second tier. Once you're done, don't forget to put your tension and your stitch length back to normal. I like to start gathering a little bit before putting the dress in the tier, so to do so, pull on the 2 long threads and start gathering. Then place your dress inside the tier, right sides together. Align the side seams and pin. Adjust your gathers to match the width of the bottom of your dress. You can always redistribute them as you sew. Pin and sew all around. You'll want to try to stitch in between those 2 basting lines you made, and just distribute the gathers as best as you can as you're sewing. Once you're done, you can remove the basting stitches by unpicking the backstitch you made at the start and gently pulling on the threads. They will start coming out of your fabric. Remove them from the right side of the fabric as well. Finish your seams by serging or overlocking. Repeat for the last tier by placing the dress inside of tier 2, right sides together, pinning the side seams, gathering and sewing all around, then finishing your seams. Now it's time to insert your elastic inside its casing. Insert it with a small safety pin and pull it through just enough so that one end of the elastic aligns with the entrance of the casing. You should still see some elastic. Back tack across the end of the elastic to secure it in place. So just do some forward stitches and back stitches. Continue pulling the elastic through the casing. At the end, I like to cut a tiny bit of the elastic just so the edge is clean. If, like me, you let your elastic go back in the casing by accident, you can use an awl or tweezers to open up the casing and pull it out. Secure the elastic the same way at this end that you did at the beginning. And here's our tight loop sewn nice and secure. Then I like to distribute the gathered fabric along the elastic. So now it's time to hem your dress. So I like to use a rolled hem pressure foot to hem the bottom of the dress. You can also do it with your iron by folding over twice 6 millimeter. I start a little bit in front of my side seam with the rolled hem pressure foot. For this to work well, I find it's good to pre-roll the fabric before it enters the foot. You can just do it by hand as you sew. When you get to the other side seam, slow down, make sure it's not too wide for the foot, and pull your fabric at the back gently to help it go over the seam. I end my seam with a back stitch a bit before the side seam where I started, and then I close that little gap with my regular foot. Okay, this is the last step. Insert the tie with a safety pin through one of the loops, typically the right one if you're right-handed, and through the front casing. If you're having trouble getting it out the other side like I did here, you can use, again, an awl or tweezers to open the casing and make space for it to pull it out. Keep pulling the tie through until it is equal in length on each side. Then pull it through the other loop. To finish the ends of the tie, I like to simply make a knot. Then you'll want to gather the neckline as you wish. Thank you so much for being here, and I hope you enjoyed this tutorial and found it helpful to sew your own Isla dress. Here are some pictures from my testers who all made their own amazing versions. They were so helpful in bringing this very first digital pattern of mine come to life, so a big thank you to them, and go check out their Instagram.